If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Almost from when his political troubles bubbled to the surface in January, Missouri Governor Eric Greitens has kept one thing constant. Even with members of his own party turning against him, the Republican governor has steadfastly refused to step aside from his job. That's the tact he took earlier this month, when a House committee released a startling report on his conduct. He called the allegations within that report lies and used familiar descriptors to characterize his plight.
This is exactly like what's happening with the witch hunts in Washington, D.C. Smearing, lying, and attacking people who want to change how things are done is wrong in Washington, and it's wrong in Missouri.
That was last week. This week's series of extraordinary events increased the governor's adversaries, including powerful elected officials like Senate President Pro Tem Ron Richard.
As a student of history and a former teacher of history, I recognize the severity of this, and I recognize what we do here is going to set a precedent for years and generations to come.
On this episode of Politically Speaking, we walk through how this past week made Greitens even more politically isolated and how Republicans are getting more and more alarmed about his impact on their party. And welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm your host, Jason Rosenbaum, a reporter with St. Louis Public Radio. Joining me in studio today is
colleague Joe Mannies
and
Rachel Lippmann.
So what are we on? Part 7, Part 70, Part 700
yes.
of As the Greitens Turns?
Yes. And of
somewhere
course,
on that line.
And of course, we are not using our regular Politically Speaking music, which does feature a nice little
snippet of the governor, as we were reminded.
Which I think we should retain.
We're going to retain that until he's no longer governor.
Until or if, yes. Right.
I know that people may be wondering why we have that clip in our theme music, but the reason we have that clip in our theme music is it's the governor of Missouri.
Right.
And if he resigns or, is forced out, we'll replace it with Mike Parson. I'm just making that announcement on the fly right here on Politically Speaking.
Breaking news. You heard it here first.
So this was a huge week in this story.
Many huge weeks we've had.
I would say, the week before, this one was probably the biggest. This comes a close second. So what I thought we would do is go in chronological order of the 3 big events that I think diminished Governor Eric Greitens' political standing even more than the startling House report we talked about on the last show. The first thing is when Attorney General Josh Hawley had a press conference on Tuesday to make this announcement about whether Greitens illegally obtained a fundraising list from the Mission Continues, a story we're going to talk about a little bit more in detail after this clip.
Evidence now in our possession would likely support a finding of probable cause that Mr. Greitens obtained an electronic donor list created by the Mission Continues for that organization's internal purposes. Mr. Greitens, however, used that list for political fundraising. He transmitted that list for political fundraising, and he did all of this without the permission of the Mission Continues.
And then late Friday, St. Louis Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner charged Greitens with illegally obtaining the fundraising list and transferring it onto a computer. We're going to talk about that a little bit more at the end of the show. But before we do that, I want to make sure that Joe provides all the context about this situation. It was originally broken by Associated Press reporter David Lieb in 2016. Joe, tell us a little bit more about this.
Okay, in a nutshell, in October 2016, Lieb broke a story. This is shortly before the election, but actually there had been discussion about it for months earlier, about the Mission Continues donor list. Now, the Mission Continues is the charity that Greitens helped set up that helps veterans, and the accusation had been floating around for a while that his campaign was using the Mission Continues donor list to try to get donations to his campaign. So Lieb had the story first in October 2016. At the time, the governor and his campaign denied any ties to the list. Okay? Now, fast forward about 6 months. In April 2017, the governor signs a consent order with the Missouri Ethics Commission acknowledging that the campaign had had the list since early 2015 and that they had been using it to help solicit donors. The campaign valued the list at roughly $600. They were fined $1,000 by the Missouri Ethics Commission. Because they paid the fine within 45 days, it ended up being $100. In the order, it states that his then campaign manager, Danny Laub, was given the list. It doesn't say he's the one who took it or anything like that. Now, the reason all of this matters, Democratic gubernatorial candidate Chris Koster had been making accusations about the list and other things about Mission Continues that he'd been accusing Greitens of not doing correctly for months leading up to the election, which Koster lost. 2, the Mission Continues could run into its own federal legal problems if it had voluntarily given the list to the campaign, because nonprofits aren't supposed to do that. It has denied doing so. So there's a lot of people looking at the wording of the consent order, seeing if there's anything that maybe the governor knowingly signed that was untrue. But frankly, I've looked at the order pretty in depth, and it's so broadly worded, it would be difficult, I think, to find anything that's improper that he could have signed that would have been overtly a lie. So I think. But that doesn't negate the controversy surrounding the Mission Continues list, especially because the consent order says they agree that some sort of violation of law took place.
And I want to just also add that Holly's announcement prompted what I would say, and I may be editorializing, a pretty extraordinary statement from the governor, and I'm going to read it right now. Fortunately for Josh, he's better at press conferences than the law. Anyone who has set foot in a Missouri courtroom knows these allegations are ridiculous. Josh has turned over the, quote, evidence he claims to have over to St. Louis Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner, a liberal prosecutor funded by George Soros who allegedly suborned perjury, falsified documents, and withheld evidence. We will dispense with these false allegations. And the governor's attorneys actually sought, what was it, a restraining order?
Basically to muzzle Holly from
Right. What's interesting about that, though, is if you look at the date that the restraining order was filed, and this is not what you think of as like a physical restraining order. It's not meant to keep someone away from someone else in the literal sense. It was actually filed on Monday before the Hawley press conference.
Yes.
If you look at the date of the court filing. And basically what it is saying is that Hawley can no longer investigate the governor fairly because he's taken a political position on this case. He has said that the governor needs to resign, and therefore a special prosecutor needs to be appointed in this case.
And Hawley actually responded to that filing at his press conference.
Well, it's a frivolous motion. I mean, look, we look forward to responding to this in court. I think we'll have the opportunity to do so very soon. The fact that the House Investigative Committee found substantial and corroborated evidence of serious wrongdoing by the governor does not immunize him from investigation on completely separate topics. And that's what we have here. My call for his resignation was based on that substantial and corroborated evidence in the House report. What we're talking about this morning is a completely different matter. I have a job to do, and I will continue to do it.
One of the allegations that's been circulating about the timing of them filing the restraining order is that allegedly this was done in part to prevent either the Attorney General's office or a law enforcement authority from interviewing Danny Laub, who I mentioned before is mentioned in the consent order. He apparently has been interviewed this week by legal authorities. And so supposedly one of the reasons this was filed on Monday was to block that.
What's also interesting, too, is if you look at the consent decree, and I know we'll maybe talk about this a little bit, is they mention the consumer fraud statute, investigations under the consumer fraud statute, not what Hawley spoke of, turning over the evidence, which would have been, I think he mentions, computer tampering or taking of materials. The restraining order that the governor filed specifically mentions the Missouri Merchandising Practices Act, which is the anti-consumer fraud statute.
Now, obviously, since we are talking about Missouri politicians here, politics has been entwined in this situation. There's been a lot of focus on the back and forth between the governor and attorney general because two Republican statewide office holders going after each other this viciously is pretty rare. I don't want to say it's never happened, like Matt Blunt and Sarah Steelman didn't get along during that tenure, but never to this level. The reason why I think it's gaining some notice is Hawley is running against U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill for the U.S. Senate. It's widely believed that Greitens' continued presence in the governor's office is not helping his cause to oust McCaskill. And McCaskill herself has pointed out, and this is a clip that I got from her speech in Hannibal in March, that Hawley could have done this a lot sooner, but decided not to until after the governor basically became politically radioactive.
So the governor pleads guilty to an ethics violation, and does Josh Hawley step up and go, okay, we're looking into this charity? Oh no, he lay low. Doesn't say a word about the charity. That was his first chance. Now later, when a real prosecutor is flooding the zone with subpoenas and investigators, he sits up all of a sudden and goes, well, I'm looking into the charity. Now I'm looking into the charity. Kind of shamed into it.
Here is Hawley's response to that line of argumentation.
I'm doing my job, and my job is to enforce the laws of Missouri, to protect the people of Missouri, and that's exactly what I'm doing, and I'm going to go on doing it no matter who criticizes me or tries to intimidate me. This office will not be intimidated, and we will not be deterred. We will go on doing our job for the people of Missouri.
Joe, what do we make of all of this?
Okay, well, there's two things, and some of it you need. Okay, first, there's no question. The consent order that I mentioned earlier, the governor signed in April 2017. Hawley had taken office a few months earlier. He could have looked at it then. To be fair, though, Hawley had a whole lot going on his plate. He had just taken office. He was trying to reorganize his own department. And there wasn't that much controversy about this. Once the governor signed it and in effect backtracked from his earlier claim that they didn't have anything to do with it. And so it wasn't until the governor, frankly, got in trouble again in January that then everybody else started looking at some of these other things that had still been going on.
The other important point in all of this is we know what Hawley mentions in his press conference, the crime that he has turned over the evidence of. And the statute of limitations on that runs out April 22nd, which is Sunday. So, you can factor that into kind of any consideration of McCaskill's allegations that he was sitting on these charges, or that I'm just doing the job and enforcing the law. So it's a computer tampering is a felony. The statute to prosecute that runs out on Sunday, which effectively means Monday.
So that's the first big development. The second big development, I believe, happened I think the same day.
I think it was late Tuesday night.
A late Tuesday night. I was sitting in a St. Louis County Council meeting. They were talking about the zoo tax. I was getting really fired up. I look at my phone and I see that Senate President Pro Tem Ron Richard wants Greitens to resign and wants impeachment to begin immediately. That's a reversal from last week because he did not explicitly call for Greitens to resign because he was following the lead of House Speaker Todd Richardson, and impeachment starts in the House. Literally 5 minutes later, we get a statement from Todd Richardson, Elijah Haar, and Rob Vescovo calling on Greitens to resign.
Yeah, and these are all leaders in the House, Republican leaders in the House.
I remarked on Twitter that I cannot think of another occasion in the entire history of Missouri where the leader of the Missouri House and the leader of the Missouri Senate, who are the same party as the governor, called for the governor to resign. Now, people brought up Judy Moriarty. There was a Democratic legislature. They called for her to resign. But I'm sorry, with all due respect to the Secretary of State's office, governor's office is on a whole nother level.
Yes.
And to me, this really was a pivotal moment because Richardson commands a lot of respect from both Republicans and Democrats. You talk even with Democrats, they will not criticize him for how he runs the House or his fairness. They will certainly criticize Richardson on issues, but I think that him calling for him to resign is going to mean that getting the majority of votes for impeachment, if and when that happens, is going to be actually
a slam dunk.
I would say it's a slam dunk. I know it's kind of perilous to make predictions, but I think this is one that I'm fairly certain on. Joe, what do you think about that development?
Yeah, I think for sure. I think when Todd Richardson, who's been very careful about this, and Todd Richardson, the speaker, his relations with the governor were on a more even keel than Ron Richard in the Senate, where there had been reports of tensions that go back since Greitens took
I've heard
office.
some many colorful off-the-record stories.
Oh, so have I.
Which were off the record, so I'm not going to actually say what they were, but continue, Joe.
Yeah, but the bottom line is that, Richard was not necessarily close to the governor or his staff. So, but in any event, for both of the leaders of the two chambers to come out and say that, I think that really upped the pressure hugely.
Now, the governor then put out another statement saying that he wasn't going to resign. I think the next day there were tweets showing him with his cabinet and working. But I have a clip now from Richardson from Thursday where he was asked about the timing of impeachment and whether he's going to try to stick to having it after the session ends, which he talked about last week, or if he was going to do what many Democrats and Ron Richard want to do and begin an impeachment process immediately.
Well, my reaction is, look, I think everybody wants this process to resolve itself as quickly as it can. What I don't want to have happen is a artificial deadline that causes our committee to have to work with undue haste. I think every member of the General Assembly should want this process to have fundamental fairness in it. I think they should want the committee to be able to complete its work and the General Assembly have time to take up whatever recommendations and whatever information is in that report without an artificial deadline.
Just to be clear, is it possible that recommendation can still come before the regular session?
I haven't spoken with the chairman on the additional information that the committee has. All of you saw the Attorney General's press conference, and obviously they have information to share with the committee. So I don't have a sense yet of whether the committee's timeline has changed.
I certainly understand what Richardson's point for not doing impeachment right away is. The legislature needs to pass a budget.
Yes, and that deadline's only about 2 weeks away.
Yeah, and they probably want to pass some legislation that they think is needed for whatever reason. But I think that the Democratic point that holding it off doesn't make a lot of sense when there's more and more stuff coming down the pike with the governor, it seems to have at least convinced Ron Richard. So what do you think happens from here?
Well, Ron Richard already has been saying today, this is Thursday, indicating that he's not going to be forwarding legislation to the governor's desk.
He can't sign them unless I sign them. So, if the minority leader decides it's in the best interest of the Senate, we will just leave that for another day, and I probably would I'd defer to her wishes.
You could see like a whole pileup of stuff, because they want to see this dealt with first. I thought that was pretty significant.
I think so, too. So that's going to be something we'll be watching in the coming days and weeks if Greitens doesn't change his mind. The third big event happened on Thursday, which was that Judge Rex Burleson ruled that the felony invasion of privacy trial that we've been talking about for weeks will go on. I think that there was some uncertainty about that. Rachel, you were in the committee hearing.
In the courtroom.
You were in the courtroom the day after the House committee report came out, and it seemed like Burleson was infuriated by what had happened, which you can explain a little bit more. What ended up happening on Thursday, and why is this case continuing?
The backstory to this, and we've kind of explained this in some of the other podcasts, but to lay it out a little bit here, is that the defense attorneys have accused Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner of not turning over evidence that is exculpatory, that is helpful to the governor. They are required by court rules, by a number of Supreme Court, by the United States rulings and a number of Missouri Supreme Court rulings that say even if the evidence could help out the defense, it has to be turned over in discovery, which is sort of the pre-trial, get all of the evidence so you can go to trial. And they had said that all of these offenses were so serious that the ultimate sanction would be to have the case thrown out. That it was just, it had tilted the playing field too far in favor of the prosecutors. There was no other way to make this up than the ultimate sanction, which would be dismissal of the trial. Burleson today in court made it pretty clear that he wasn't happy with the way that Gardner had comported herself in terms of turning over evidence. He was like, you have violated the rules here. And he held on to the possibility, didn't rule out the possibility that he could dismiss this case later if future violations happen. But what he said is there are ways with short of throwing out the case that we can tilt the field back towards level. What he will allow the defense to do is to redepose two key witnesses. They will be allowed to redepose KS, who is the woman at the center of this, the woman with whom Greitens had an affair and allegedly took a photo of her, semi-nude photo of her without her consent. Her ex-husband, who we've talked about his role in this a little bit on the podcast, he recorded the tapes that outlined
of a
private conversation.
Yes, allegedly. She thought it was private.
Well, it was private. It's not allegedly private. It is no longer private. But that made the basis of the TV story that started this whole thing, and of a private investigator that the circuit attorney has hired. He's also at the center of this because he had allegedly lied in his first deposition about whether he took notes, whether a videotape of interviews existed, and that's the evidence, the exculpatory evidence that they've had to be continually turning over. So they will be allowed to redepose. They may find additional information that they think will bolster their defense, but the case for now goes forward.
I obviously, Greitens' voluminous defense team, because both of us were in the courtroom, and there must be like 10 to 12 lawyers now.
There's 6 named lawyers who have entered appearances, meaning they can speak, and I'm sure support staff from all of their teams, the summer associates.
So I'm sure that they would have preferred for the case to be thrown out, obviously.
Sure, and I'm sure who's ever paying for Greitens' legal defense would have also wanted the case to be thrown out because those guys don't come cheap.
Exactly. So I don't think you can consider that a victory for Greitens by any means. But on the other hand, it's not out of the question that if these witnesses are redeposed, they could conflict prior statements, their credibility could be called into question. I mean, the ex-husband alone has, I don't want to say massive credibility problems, but serious credibility problems. From what we talked about before, where he said, oh, I didn't want this to be in the media, and then tweeting out the fact that Greitens is a homewrecker, to the fact that we don't know what third party is paying Al Watkins, which legislators want to know about.
Al Watkins is the lawyer for the ex-husband.
So I think that there's fertile ground for them to possibly bolster their case. And as they would probably say numerous times, there's still no photo. Mm-hmm. They say there's no evidence that a photo was transmitted. And that may still be in their favor if a photo doesn't materialize. Is that basically that's my observation. What's your observation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I was as he was reading out his opinion in court today, I leaned over to one of the other reporters in the room, and I think a lot of us thought that he was going to throw the case out. When he was initially reading it out, he's talking about how there are serious violations here. Every defendant is due a fair trial, that, you know, the circuit attorney is a representative of the people. And from what I've heard talking to people kind of in the legal community, kind of doing profiles and getting to know some of the players on legal teams on both sides, is that, you know, Burleson he enjoys watching people practice law, and he, you know, will try to find a way to craft a solution that maybe not everyone is happy with, but makes his point very, very clear. And it was clear in court that he thinks Gardner committed sanctionable actions, as he put it. What he said in court was, we're not here to debate what should happen as a result of what she's done, if this is ethically a violation, or if Mr. Tisby, the investigator, has committed a crime. He said within sort of the corners of this case, this is how we are going to fix some of the problem.
So now the fourth thing, which actually happened after we published this podcast. If you're listening to this, we actually updated this podcast at 7:19 p.m. on Friday to make sure that it is fully up to date before it gets posted on johncombest.com tomorrow. What it was is what we said at the beginning of the show. St. Louis Circuit Attorney Gardner charged Greitens with illegally obtaining the Mission Continues list and transferring it onto a computer.
Well, and overseeing the transfer, rather, of it onto a computer, which then went to his campaign. In effect, what he's accused of overseeing, transferring the list to his campaign so his campaign could use it to raise money. Now, for Greitens, one of the problems is, as I mentioned earlier, he's already signed the state consent order admitting that they improperly used the list. So what this charges are in effect saying is that he's the one who oversaw doing it. The consent order with the state never really got into who did it.
And I just will read a statement from Greitens that we got late Friday, and I'm going to read part of it. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's very long, and it attacks Gardner for the felony invasion of privacy trial, which I don't want to get into right now because that's not what we're talking about. The latest charge is about my work at the Mission Continues. When I came home from Iraq after service as a Navy SEAL, I started the Mission Continues to help veterans. In 7 years, I ran that organization. We helped thousands of veterans, won national awards for excellence, and became one of the finest veterans charities in the country. Those were some of the best years of my life. I am grateful every day for the chance to help the men and women I served with. I stand by that work. I will have my day in court. I will clear my name. This prosecutor can come after me with everything she's got. But as all faithful people know, in time comes the truth, and the time for truth is coming. As several people pointed out on Twitter, he doesn't address the charges there.
Right, because the charges aren't whether the charity was valid or did a great
and
work or anything. It was great.
I want to be clear here. There have been some people who have said the Mission Continues was simply a front for Greitens' political and personal ambitions. The truth of the matter is I've talked with people that have actually been affected by the Mission Continues. It is a legitimate charity that's done a lot of great work.
And it's got a lot of honors. So this is nothing about the charity. In fact, the charity officials had made clear that they did not okay the transfer of the list to a political campaign for anybody. And they frankly had to do that because if something like this happens with their approval and it's selectively going only to certain campaigns, they could run afoul of federal laws.
I will just add this. Ed Dowd, one of Greitens' attorneys, said in a statement, Eric made the Mission Continues. He raised millions of dollars for it. The veterans helped thousands of veterans. The money helped thousands of veterans transform their lives. He dedicated years of his life to creating the organization, and he spent the earliest period working with no pay. It was an extraordinary act of public service. Now he's being accused of stealing an email list from an organization he built. Give me a break. Not only did he create this list donor by donor, friend by friend, but the Mission Continues still has the list. The idea that this is a crime is absurd. How convenient he's being charged just 2 days before the statute of limitation runs out on a so-called crime that's 3 years old. Does that really address, though, what he's being accused of?
No, because what he's accused of is transferring the list by computer. Now, frankly, looking at it one way, if he created the list over the years, which he may very well have, if he had kept a copy on his personal computer and used that copy to solicit donations for his campaign, I think it would be hard for them to charge him with anything. But if he went into the Mission Continues operation, into their computer files, took that list and transferred it or oversaw the transfer, which is technically what the charges say, that appears to be or could be a violation of state law.
We'll be talking about this a lot more next week. So I want to transition for the last few minutes of our discussion to talk again about the political impact of all this, which we talked about before in various stages. But I think at this point, when so many things are piling up, Republicans are becoming more and more alarmed about how this is going to affect their chances in 2018 and beyond. I'm going to play a clip now from Chris Howard. He's a longtime Republican activist from St. Louis County that Joe and I know very well. I interviewed him for a story that aired on Morning Edition on Thursday. I only got like 3 seconds of him talking in that story, but I wanted to give him a little bit more space to explain how this entire situation is affecting Missouri Republicans.
It's been a dividing effect. You have basically 3 camps of people. You have people who didn't like Greitens to begin with, and so they're this is a self-fulfilling prophecy for them. You have people in the middle who are discouraged, embarrassed by some of the actions, the more salacious actions that have been reported. And then you have the Greitens loyalists. They don't care. They look at this like the Bill Clinton situation. The Democrats followed in line no matter to the death. No matter what Bill did, it was going to be okay. So you have those 3 groups. But as we move in, this is an election year. As we move into the election year, this is dividing and it is troubling for the party. So it's a tough situation.
In addition to the fact that now you have Holly and Greitens fighting, you then have what Gron Howard mentioned, that grassroots activists and supporters seem to be fighting and disagreeing with themselves, which there are probably more Republicans in Missouri than there were, say, in 2000. But that still is not a good thing when you have to win a statewide election like U.S. Senate.
Yeah, well, I think, and they are concerned that this could affect some of this, the handful of swing district state Senate seats. That while the Republicans have such huge majorities, no matter what, they're still going to be in the majority in 2019. The only issue is how much in the Missouri General Assembly. But I think for many Republicans, the game starts and ends with trying to knock off Senator Claire McCaskill, and anything that affects that, they're concerned about. They're concerned about that Holly hasn't raised as much money as they want. They're concerned about, the president was here in March to help Holly raise money, and Greitens wasn't at the airport. They made sure you didn't see him anywhere that day. And there have been discussions, other media outlets with representatives in Washington have indicated there's been talk at the White House about whether or not Trump needs to get involved to either talk to Greitens and try to encourage him to get out or what. On the other hand, the president has his own issues with women. That
I was going to say, and I don't mean to be blunt here, but President Trump has been married 3 times, and I think that his first failed because of infidelity. Is that fair to say?
Well, and there's all this stuff going on with porn stars and all this and that.
I'm sorry.
There's the Access Hollywood tape.
Yeah, but let's keep going.
So there are some Republicans who are like, no, let's keep the president out of this. But it is intriguing because while they're watching this from Washington, you're not seeing much said. McCaskill has been very careful to be specific, to comment on specific parts of it, has said she's not going to talk about the legal case, although she did come out a few days ago and basically called for Greitens to resign. Senator Roy Blunt, who's a Republican, who really is, if you take Greitens out of the mix, Roy Blunt is the most powerful Republican in the state. He's been careful. He hasn't specifically called for Greitens to step down, but he certainly has encouraged him, to quit attacking the Holly. Blunt is not shy when he feels his time is right. So far, Blunt has not said Greitens needs to leave.
The one thing that has kind of struck me at first when there weren't immediate calls for there were immediate calls for resignation, but not necessarily for impeachment, was just how long the stalemate could have gone on. We're talking about a barely first-term governor when all of this broke back in January. And before the impeachment talk and all of the push for the calls to resign from his own party really started coming out, if he is found not guilty of a crime in the felony invasion of privacy trial, I mean, what's to force him out other than impeachment? Like, this could be a very long standoff, a 3-year stalemate between the legislature and the governor. Like, that's not good for your party if you're in charge.
Well, even if this had not come out in January, he was already at odds with most of the Republican leaders in the legislature on other stuff. So this was building. I mean, I've maintained this for some time. One of the reasons he's been in trouble is because he didn't have any friends before. There was a whole lot of disputes, which I won't, regurgitate. But the bottom line was he was already sort of at odds with most of the Republican leaders before this broke.
So the final point I want to make before we sign off for this week is I want to read part of a letter from former Lieutenant Governor Peter Kinder. Former Lieutenant Governor Peter Kinder ran against Greitens in 2016. He came in third place. He did endorse Greitens, unlike John Brunner, who I don't think ever did. But he was asked to go to an event in Cape Girardeau for Greitens during that campaign. And an email, which has been circulating both in the traditional and subscriber-based medium, I'm talking about Missouri Scout here, which broke the story, has been talking about this email. And the former lieutenant governor actually sent it to me. What conclusions should the public draw from a candidate alleging corruption throughout Jeff City and claiming to be the cleansing agent against that corruption who refuses to make this rather routine disclosure? And in this case, it was about his tax returns, but Kinder was also talking about the nonprofits that had been created to help Greitens.
Yeah, and those nonprofits, we didn't know where the money was coming from and where it was going.
And Greitens had attacked Brunner for secret money, which we've talked about many times. Eric, the world is watching as your campaign is teaching future aspiring candidates how to do this. What will be your lesson and your legacy? We read from the public prints that some prestigious publication or other has named you, what was it? One of the 50 greatest leaders in the world? Leadership takes many forms. The most salient is action, leadership by example. Are you leading by example in that fashion? I hope you will give careful consideration to the example you're setting. And I think the reason why this email has caught attention, because the 2016 campaign is ancient history at this point, but Kinder's letter or email is basically saying that Greitens' problems, which have manifested themselves in spectacular fashion, were very predictable, and that a lot of people saw this type of meltdown coming. Should we have seen all of this madness and crisis coming based off the warning signs of the campaign?
Well, I think hindsight's always 20/20, and I think many of us saw many things, and many of us wrote about him. I mean, to be fair, the public decided that Eric Greitens was who they wanted to be their next governor, and many of these things that people are talking about had been written about, maybe not in as detail because we didn't know everything, but his temperament, the accusations about lack of transparency in his campaign reports, which I wrote about extensively. There was just various things that had been written about. The public decided that was not as important as other things about him that they liked. He was elected by the people of Missouri, and I think that's something that people have to remember. And this is one little similarity between him and Judy Moriarty, the infamous Secretary of State from the early 90s who got impeached, is that both of them were not part of their party establishment. They were not supposed to have won their primaries. They did. They weren't supposed to have won their general elections, at least till the end, and they did, because the voters, for whatever reason, saw something in them that they liked. And I think that's something that the Republican leaders in the state are having to grapple with, is because while they may have had concerns about him from the get-go, he was elected. And so from his standpoint, he sees his fellow Republicans in the state capitol as more of an enemy than the public, and he's seen that from the day he was inaugurated.
And not to denigrate the average Missouri voter, but the average Missouri voter probably isn't reading and absorbing and putting the context on those articles that are being printed. They're, watching the commercials on TV. Maybe they're skimming the headlines and thinking it's, another outlet trying to go after the candidate that I prefer. This is just an opposition research dump. They're not as into the nuances. They're not thinking of all of the nuances, and this isn't a knock on them. All of us in this room are on the far end of the bell curve in terms of how we think about, absorb, and understand politics. So I agree with Joe's point that, this was written about, but did people care? And that's not a knock. There's a lot of other things going on in people's lives to sit there and be like, oh, well, this guy's hiding stuff about his charity. Who cares? He helped a lot of people. No big deal.
Yeah, and I promise to our listeners, I'm not going to break down into tears during this final thought. And I appreciate our listeners bearing with me last week because it was a very emotional week for a lot of people. I'm just going to speak for myself here. When I covered the gubernatorial race, my big focus was trying to pin down candidates on issues. So you saw articles about how Greitens and Koster felt about vouchers or what they wanted to do post-Ferguson. Or what
right to work,
or what they were going to do for right to work, or what they were going to do on SJR 39, which was a constitutional amendment associated with gay rights. And I am a very issue-oriented reporter. I'm obviously a political reporter, and I have to report on the politics of everything. But I mean, my goal as a reporter going into them is to really get a sense of what these people would do in office. So if that meant that I wasn't focusing enough on some of the controversies that we're talking now, I take responsibility for that because in my mind, the reason we cover politicians and we cover elections is because they're going to make major decisions that are going to affect everybody's lives. And maybe this entire situation is instructive for us going forward, but I will agree with Joe. We wrote about a lot of these issues extensively about his donors. People could listen to our debate and hear his temperament just there for almost an hour and a half. He was on our podcast for almost 40 minutes where people got a sense for him. I think that we did some diligence. I think we could have done more. I think that maybe we could have looked into some of the campaign stuff more. But we're only two people, and I'm not going to make any excuses beyond that.
And there was a lot of other races and a lot of other stuff going on. But the bottom line is that while you can, when you're covering somebody, sometimes you're like, oh, there's this about that person or that. Sometimes that stuff manifests themselves when they're elected, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
You can't always predict how someone who is a good campaigner, how they are as a governor.
Thank you guys so much for coming on this podcast to explain this week's events. I think we'll be back next week for another Greitens Roundup. Do you think that's fair to say?
We'll see.
We will see. For all of our stories, stlpublicradio.org. Follow me on Twitter, Jay Rosenbaum. Follow Joe on Twitter at
Jay Mannies. It's JMANNIES.
Follow Rachel at
R. Lippmann, 2 P's, 2 N's.
The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer, St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on the Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.